quite suddenly the Germans invaded the Low Countries, France fell, there was the Dunkirk evacuation, and I remember at the Sainsbury's where I worked, somebody coming out into the warehouse and almost with satisfaction rubbing his hands together and saying, well, we're on our own now. You know, the feeling these Allies have never been any good anyway, unreliable lot, and now we were going to fight the war on our own.
I can remember getting reports of bombs falling in other towns, I mean towns perhaps on the south coast, and to me I got the feeling of this thing gradually encroaching on one.
While I was in the bath, the sirens went, and OK, the sirens had gone off quite a lot recently, and I thought, oh, nothing to worry about, so I carried on. Then all of a sudden I heard this peculiar noise, which I afterwards found out was the noise of bombs falling, the scream through the air, and then crump, crump, and the bath sort of shook, and I thought, Christ, bombs.
I remember going in the shelter and kind of hugging the wall with my younger sister. I was about 17, 18, and she was about 15, I suppose.
The first effect of the bombs dropping was to blow up the electricity mains. So our lights went out in the first minute or two. Our secondary lighting consisted of candles which we set in jam jars. So the mobilising for the Blitz on the first night from West Ham, the West Ham control, and we controlled 10 fire brigades in North East London. That was carried out by the light of candles set in jam jars. Bombs coming down, screaming, the row they make, it's sort of warning, say, look out, here comes death.
I remember my dad walking up to the top of the road and I sat on his shoulders and we was watching the docks burn and the huge flames and the fires, and Mum stood and cried. You know, it was very sad because I mean, it was people's lives.
And when I looked around, I saw an arm sticking out from under this great slab of concrete. And I went over, and I knew it was Wally Turley because he had a malformed fingernail. And there it was. And I knew it was him. I looked underneath to see if I could do anything, but it was impossible.
We had the intention, the full intention, to disturb and to demoralize the people so that they would possibly made the demonstration against the policy of the government, at least against the policy of bombing towns.
It was a lovely sunny morning, another Sunday, except that, how many? I think about 450 or more people had been killed in East London, a huge number injured, terrible destruction carried on, and they were coming back that night.
It was packed like sardines, absolutely packed, you couldn't get anything. And all panicky, of course. People screaming and crying, the kiddies crying. And they were just talking, trying to comfort one another, but they were all anxious to get away. They was pushing one another to get out. And when is that coming? When is this? What's going to take us? You know, because we was all confused what was going to happen. And that's all we did. We sat there and waited. Then all of a sudden, a woman comes. She said, "Oh, there's a mauve light going up, Rose." She said, "There's going to be a raid." I said, "Oh," I said, "I can't sit here." I said, "Florrie, I can't sit here, darling." I said, "I hate big buildings." I said, "I'm going over the little shelter."
All of a sudden there's this terrific bang because the school had been hit with this landmine, and it was really, well, heartbreaking to hear it, really, and there's nothing you could do about it.
And when I got there, I could see the crater and the bomb building, so I jumped off, and there was a young woman standing on top of the crater, a nurse, and she was crying. I said, "Oh, don't cry, love." I said, "We're all coming."
I did pick up this, as I thought was a little girl. I don't know if it was a girl, boy or what, but unrecognisable, terrible. It made me bad. It absolutely made me ill. I was sick.
As they brought a body out, they'd put it in a car. It was quite a lot of small cars which would take one body and they would move it away. And we all stood there, and everything was so quiet.
76 was the official death toll at Hallsville School, but local belief has it that far more were buried beneath the rubble. Beyond doubt, a community destroyed, a neighbourhood in mourning.
My husband was away at sea. He was a merchant seaman, he knew nothing about the raids or nothing. And he did a 2-month trip, and he came home the day after the bombing. And he went down, he said the streets were so bare, it's just like a film you see on the cowboys' films. He said, no, I couldn't see a soul to find out where you were. He searched everywhere, couldn't find us. 2 days and 2 nights he walked about trying to find me and my children. And all of a sudden, my second oldest one, he's 52 now, he shouted, there's Daddy, there's Daddy. Of course, when he shouted, there's Daddy, I looked, it was my husband. And you never see a scene like it. My husband was sobbing. I was sobbing. Everybody else. Sorry.
Then we would insert a pig's bladder into the main with a stopcock on the end of the pig's bladder, which we used to blow up, and that would fill itself with air and mould itself to the circumference of the main, stopping off the gas escaping through the fracture or if it was on fire.
Learning that job was purely as you go along day to day. I mean, we were issued with what? A truck, 200 sandbags, I think, a hammer and a chisel, and a fuse key. And that was the total equipment. And I went down this hole, very lonely when you get down there, you know, with this stethoscope, and there's this large bomb, 1,000 kilogram, called Herman. That was named after Goering, a rather tubby chap.
If a body was in several parts or one part crushed, it had to be identification by the best possible way. Sometimes there might be a scar, sometimes it was almost impossible, and sometimes I think bodies were identified really by a process of pure elimination. Well, there's some terrible things. I remember one woman that was... I saw a mortuary keep actually being physically sick. It just had a wife, or widow of course then, cradling her husband's severed head for hours. And even he couldn't stand it.
Shops were devastated, water supplies were cut off, gas supplies were cut off. There was very little electric cooking in those days, and they had so many problems to deal with, and yet they always seemed to be, well, cheerful in their way. The East End women, there's nothing like them.
London can take it meant the East End. And people in the East End accepted this to some extent because they knew that the East End was the docks and the docks were the inviting place. Nevertheless, you know, they were conscious that they were taking the brunt of it and lots of other people weren't seeing a great deal of brunt.
Hampstead was comparatively safe, but you really felt you were in the war because you could hear the enemy aircraft overhead. There was a tremendous battery of anti-aircraft. The odd bombs fell in Hampstead, but nothing like in the East End. And one had a tremendous feeling of guilt because you felt thrilled in some ways to be in it with all this excitement. My little daughter used to say, "Can I stay up and see the flashes tonight?" And we'd go up on Parliament Hill sometimes, which is a big hill in Hampstead Heath, and you'd watch the bombing in the East End, and you knew people were really having a terrible time there. A leader emerged in the ARP, and he happened to live in a council flat, and he looked after the animals at the Medical Institute, and his name was Mr. Short. And he became the natural leader, telling everybody what to do, and so all the very posh people in Hampstead, like judges, and barristers and company directors were all taking their orders from Mr. Short, whom we all adored. And Mr. Short was invited to all the houses, and all the class barriers broke down. We were all in it together.
There were all kinds of people, writers. I mean, Stephen Spender was in the same fire station as I, and so was William Sansom, the writer, Henry Green. And then, you know, you'd be having your lunch with anybody, with a greengrocer, with somebody who was previously digging the road. And I love this. I thought this was absolutely marvellous, and I'm, in a way, very happy that this happened. It's a pity that it takes a war to do it, but I found these people absolutely fascinating, very, very interesting indeed.
We had to be travellers, so any bedding that we took down there had to be in suitcases, so that nobody knew that we were going to be there all night. And we used to get a ticket and travel from one station to another until such time as the tubes closed or the warning went, and then we were safe.
We used to have a space for 5 of us, and all cramming. That was our position there, and nobody should encroach on it. And if somebody suddenly wanted to throw their blanket to make their beds, my mum would get up and say, "Move, you've gone over there." And it was like, that was my place. And you didn't cope because there was arguments.
And there they were, stripped of all of it, lying there asleep with mouths open in makeshift bedding and babies being fed, all of the things which ought to take place in private, and there they were, nakedly displayed in public. It was pretty awful.
Well, I felt ashamed, glad to be there, but ashamed to be there, that I thought they're all going out enjoying themselves. We were stuck down the tube all the time, and you couldn't make yourself up or get yourself ready for bed as you would normally do, and it was just putting up with it, and you got used to it.
There was no use to think about it. You had to drop your bombs, you had your target, and so from each side there was a ruthless bombing, and no one could resolve to stop it.
Nobody. No, I mean, any fireman had never seen this thing. It was 50,000 times bigger than anything that had happened. I know the city quite well, and you know, it was a different place. We handed him this hose, and we walked across this narrow lane. I suppose it must have been something minimum 5 seconds, a maximum 10, when there was the most really tremendous rending, crunching sound.
And I remember getting to Queen Victoria Street and sitting astride my bike, and there was a control point there, and there were 2 district officers standing there, and I remember overhearing this remark, "Well, the whole city's alight." But the amazing thing was, from where we were, we could see St. Paul's, and
we said, nobody will believe us. Nobody will believe that we've lived through this.
And then suddenly it was quite near. I do remember the man saying to me, "We'll soon have you out." He said, "All I've got to do is get your arm out." And I looked at this arm which was sticking out of the debris, and I said, "That's not my arm." And he said, "Yes, it is, love, it's got the same coat." But I don't remember coming out of the shelter. I do remember being in the ambulance, and I think that for me was probably the worst part, insofar as I felt as if somebody's blood was dripping on me from above me, and I found that awful. Mainly, I think, because I didn't know whose blood it was, whether it was somebody I knew and loved or not. I couldn't use this arm. And when I got to the house and there was milk bottles outside, I just knew nobody had come home and taken them in. My younger sister died. My father died. I had 2 aunts who died and an uncle. The 7 were buried on the same day. My brother said that they put Union Jacks on the coffins. He doesn't know who did it, but they did. I didn't go to the funeral.
People looked after themselves, and as you saw people doing awful, cowardly things, of just ignoring everybody else and looking after themselves.
I mean, no one knows what courage you've got till it actually happens. You don't realise it, what you got inside you, until someone's in danger or something. Then you try to help the best way you can.
I'd give anything for the war to be over. I mean, this was living a terrible life, a life of fear the whole time. And I thought, well, I would have been ready to have given in. I was demoralised at that stage because I think it went on too long.
The incidents I saw in the East End of London would shatter anybody. And how those East Enders put up with it, I don't know.
I think today that when I look back, we lived through a war of our own without firing shots. We didn't do the firing, we were just fired at. And it was the intensity of a war. But we just weren't going to be beaten.